Section 16. Of Little Journeys to the Homes of English Authors. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Jennifer Beckett Wood. Little Journeys to the Homes of English Authors by Elbert Hubbard. Section 16. Samuel T. Coleridge, Part 1. Beneath the blaze of a tropic sun, the mountain rays are the thrones of frost, this through the absence of objects to reflect the rays. What no one with us shares seems scarce our own. We need another to reflect our thoughts. Samuel Taylor Coleridge. Samuel T. Coleridge was a thinker, and thinkers are so rarely found that the world must take note of them. John Stuart Mill, writing in 1840, assigned first place among English philosophers to Jeremy Bentham, incidentally mentioning that Samuel Taylor Coleridge was Bentham's only rival. In philosophy there is an apostolic succession. We build on the past, and all the centuries of turmoil and travail which have gone before have made this moment possible. There has never been any such thing as the fall of man, for the march of the race has been a continual climb, a movement onward and upward. Were it not for Coleridge and Bentham, we could not have had Buckle, Wallace, and Spencer, for the minds of men would not have been prepared to give them a hearing. "Half the battle is in catching the speaker's eye," said Thomas Brackett Reed, and a John the Baptist to prepare the way is always necessary. Without Coleridge to quietly ignore the question of precedent, and refuse to accept a thing without proof, and ask eternally and yet again, "How do you know?" Charles Darwin, with his Origin of Species, would have been laughed out of court, or probably, had Darwin been persistent, we would have consigned him to the stocks, burned his book in the public square, and with the aid of logical thumbscrews made him recant. Even as it was, the gibes and guffaws of the press and pulpit came near drowning the modest, moderate voice of Darwin, and for a score of years his reputation as a scientist seemed to be trembling in the balance. Yet today the man who would seriously attempt in an educated assembly to throw obloquy on the doctrine of evolution and the name of Charles Darwin would find himself speedily listed with Brother Jasper of Richmond, Virginia. The church now, everywhere, has its Drummonds who build on Darwin and use his citations as proof, and Drummond merely expressed what the many believe, no more. The man who has dared to think for himself and voiced his thought, the emancipated man, has been as one in a million. What usually passes for thought is only the repetition of things we have heard or been told. We memorize, repeat by rote, and call it thought. With the church and state in control of food and clothes, and with spears, clubs, knives, and guns ready to suppress whatsoever seems dangerous to their stability, it is a miracle that men have ever improved on anything, for progress has been for centuries a perilous performance. To question a priest was blasphemy. To reason with a judge was heinous. To think and decide for yourself was to invite torture and death. And all this was very natural, simply because the superior class who monopolized the good things of earth were obliged, in order to enslave and tax men, to make them believe that their power was derived from God. And thus was taught the divine right of kings, the duty of submission, the necessity of belief, and the sinfulness of doubt. The source of all knowledge was declared to be a book, and the right of interpretation of this book was given to one class alone, those who sided with and were part of the superior class. The reason the race has progressed so slowly is because the strong, vigorous, and independent have been suppressed, either by legal process or exterminated through war, which reaps the best and lets the weak, the diseased, and the cowards go. Those who doubted and questioned have been deprived of food and clothes. disgraced, mobbed, robbed, lashed naked at the cart's tail, burned at the stake, or separated from their families and transported beyond the sea to be devoured by wild beasts, die in jungles, or toil out their lives in slavery. But still there were always a few who would doubt, and a few who would question, and in the early part of the 18th century in England, the government was being put to severe straits to cope with the difficulty. Lying in the Thames were receiving ships on which were crowded men and women to be transported. When the ship was full, crowded to her utmost, she sailed away with her living cargo. From 1650 to 1750, over 40,000 people were sent away for their country's good. The hangman worked overtime, all prisons were crowded, and the walls of Newgate bulged with men and women, old and young, who were believed to be dangerous to the stability and well-being of the superior class, that is, those who had the right to tax others. Finally, the enormity of bloodshed and woe involved caused a sort of concession on both sides to be agreed upon. Oppression continued will surely lead to a point where it cures itself, and the superior class in England, with a wise weather eye, saw the reef on which they were in danger of striking. They heard the breakers and began to grant concessions, unwillingly, of course, concessions wrung from them. The censorship was abolished, reform bills introduced, the rights of free speech and a free press were partially recognised. The clergy, taking the cue, began to preach more love and less damnation, for the pew ever dictates to the pulpit what it shall preach. Thus general relaxation was in order to meet the competition of rival sects and independent preachers that was springing up, for although creeds never change, yet their interpretation does, and liberal sects do their work not by growing strong, but by making all others more liberal. Thus the latter part of the 18th century witnessed a weakening of both sides through compromise. The schools and colleges were pedantic, complacent, smug, and self-satisfied. By giving in a few points they had absorbed the radicals, and the political protesters had been bought off with snug places in the excise. Pretended knowledge passed for wisdom, dignity paraded as worth, affectation and hypocrisy patronised virtue, and Coleridge appears upon the scene, a conservative, with a beautiful innocence and an indifference to all pretended authority, and asks, "How do you know?" The number of people who have written their names large in literature, who were the children of clergymen, is no mere coincidence. Tennyson, Addison, Goldsmith, Emerson, Lowell, Jane Austen, Charlotte Bronte, Coleridge, you can add to the list to suit. Young people follow example, and the habit of the father in writing out his thoughts causes others of the family to try it too. Then there is an atmosphere of books in a rectory, and leisure to think, and best of all, the income is not so great but that the practice of economy of time and money is duly enforced by necessity. To be launched into a library and learn by absorption is a great blessing. Samuel Taylor Coleridge was born in 1772, the son of the Reverend John Coleridge of Ottery St. Mary, a small village of Devonshire. The rector was also a schoolmaster, just as all clergymen were before division of labour forced itself upon us. This worthy clergyman was twice married, his first wife bearing him 3 children, the second 10. Samuel was the last of the brood, the 13th, but his parents were not superstitious. The youngest in a big family, like the first, is apt to have a deal of love lavished upon him. The question of discipline has proved its own futility, and when a baby comes to parents approaching 50, depend upon it, that child transforms the household into a monarchy, with himself as tyrant. This may be well, and it may not. Little Samuel Taylor seemed to be aware of his power. He evolved a wondrous precocity and ruled the rectory with a rod of iron. When he was 5, he propounded questions that shook the orthodoxy of the worthy vicar to its very centre. Yet, remarkable as was the intellect of Samuel Taylor Coleridge, the family would not have remained in obscurity without him. In fact, the very brightness of his fame caused the excellence of his brothers to be lost in the shadow. His brother James became the father of Henry Nelson Coleridge, who married his cousin Sarah, the daughter of our poet. To anticipate a little, it is well enough here to say that the daughter of Coleridge was a woman of remarkable excellence, and if you wish to disprove the adage that genius does not transmit itself, she is a good example to bring up, even though there is a difference between fact and truth. James Coleridge was also the father of Mr. Justice Coleridge, himself the father of Lord Chief Justice Coleridge. And since iconoclasm is not out of place in an essay on Coleridge, it can also be stated that when Sarah Coleridge married her cousin, she did a wise thing. The marriage was a most happy one, and the children of these cousins have shown themselves to be beyond the average. And once, certainly not with his daughter in mind, Coleridge debated the question of consanguinity with Charles Lamb, and proved to his own satisfaction at least that the marriage of cousins was eminently sane, proper, just, and right, and fraught with the best results for humanity. The only indictment that can be brought against the father of Coleridge is that he was a zealous Latin scholar, and proposed that the term ablative be abolished as insufficient, and that in its stead should be used that of quale quare quidative case. He was a simple, amiable, excellent man, who did his work the best he could, and was beloved by all the parish. As to the excellence of the established order of things, he had no doubts. Government and religion were divine institutions, and should be upheld by all honest men. As to the vicar's wife, we know little, but enough of a glance is given into her character through letters to show that she had in her make-up a trace of noble discontent. She was not entirely happy in her surroundings, and the amiable ways of her husband were often an exasperation to her, rather than a pleasure. Even amiability can be overdone. He never saw more than a mile from home, but her eyes swept England from Cornwall to Scotland, and few men, even, saw so far as that 100 years ago. The discontent of Samuel Taylor Coleridge was the heritage of mother to son. When Samuel was 9 years of age, the father passed away. The widow would have been in sore financial straits had it not been for the older children, and even as it was, strict economy and untiring industry were in order. Out of sympathy, Mr. Justice Buller, who had been a pupil of the Reverend John Coleridge, proposed to secure the youngest boy a scholarship in Christ's Hospital School, and so we find him entered there, July 18th, 1782. This was a year memorable in the history of America, and the alertness of the charity boy's intellect is shown in that he was aware of the struggle between England and the colonies. He discussed the situation with his schoolfellows, and explained that the mother country had made a mistake in exacting too much. His sympathies were with the colonies, but he thought submission on their part was in order when the stamp tax was removed, and that complete independence was absurd. The colonies needed someone to protect them. Such reasoning in a boy of 10 years seems strange, especially in view of the fact that a noted professor of pedagogy had recently explained to us that no child under 14 is capable of independent reasoning. But it is quite certain that young Coleridge's opinions were not borrowed, for all the lad's acquaintances, who thought of the matter at all, considered the Americans simply rebels who merited death. Coleridge remained at Christ's Hospital for 8 years, and before he left had easily taken his place as Deputy Grecian. Charles Lamb has given many delightful glimpses of that schoolboy life in the Essays of Elia. Middleton, afterwards Bishop of Calcutta, called the attention of Boyer, the master, to Coleridge by saying, "There is a boy who reads Virgil for amusement." Boyer was a strict disciplinarian, but he was ever on the lookout for a lad who loved books, the average youth getting out of all the study he could. The master began to encourage young Coleridge, and Coleridge responded. He wrote verses and essays, and was a prodigy in memorizing. According to Boyer's idea, and it was the prevailing idea everywhere then, and is yet in some sections, memorization was the one thing desirable. If the subject were Plato, and the master had forgotten his book, he called on Coleridge to recite, and the tall, fair-haired boy, with the big, dreamy eyes, would rise and give page after page, verbatim et literatim. Before Coleridge went to Cambridge, when 19 years old, he had taken on that masterly quality in conversation that made his society sought, even to the last. Lamb has told us of the gentle voice, not loud nor deep, but full of mellow intonations and bell-like in its purity. Such a voice, laden with fine feeling, carrying conviction, only goes with a great soul. No doubt, though, the young man had grown into a bit of a dictator, and this habit of harangue he carried with him to college. To talk enabled him to think, and expression is necessary to growth. So the habit of argument with Coleridge seemed nature's method of developing his powers of mental analysis. No more foolish saying was ever launched than, "Children should be seen and not heard." From lisping babyhood Coleridge talked, and talked much. When he was 20, at Cambridge, he drew the boys to his room until it was crowded to suffocation, just by the magic of his voice and the subtle quality of his thought. His questioning mind went right to the heart of things, and in his divisions and heads and subheads even the professors could not always follow him. Let us hope that he himself always knew what he was trying to explain. He discussed metaphysics, theology, and politics, and very naturally got to treading on thin ice. In theology, his reasoning led him into Unitarianism, then a very fearful thing, and in politics he dallied with Madame la Révolution. A polite note from the master of the college, suggesting that he talk less and follow the curriculum a little more closely, led him straight to the master, with whom he proposed to argue the case, or publicly debate it. This was terrible. Stephen Crane, at Syracuse University 100 years later, did just such a thing. He sought to argue a point in the classroom with Chancellor Sims. "Tut, tut," said the Chancellor. "Have you forgotten what St. Paul says on that very theme?" "Yes, I know," replied the best catcher ever on the Syracuse nine. "Yes, I know what St. Paul says, but I differ with St. Paul." And Stevie, unconsciously, was standing on the well-lubricated chute that landed him soon well outside the campus. The authorities did not admire the brilliant young Coleridge, full of his reasons and prolix abstractions. He was attracting too much attention to himself, and gradually gathering about him a throng of admirers who might disturb the balance of things. He was there anyway only through sufferance, and an intimation was given him that if he were not willing to accept things as they existed and as they were taught, he had better go elsewhere. Piqued by his treatment, and feeling he had been misunderstood and wronged, he suddenly disappeared. Some months afterwards, an acquaintance found him in a company of dragoons, duly enlisted in His Majesty's service, under an assumed name. The authorities at Jesus College were notified, and knowing that such a youth was out of place serving as a soldier, and feeling further a small pang of regret, possibly for having driven him away, a plan was set on foot to secure his discharge. This was soon brought about, and doubtless much to Coleridge's relief. Ere long he found himself back at Cambridge, a little subdued and a trifle more discreet for his rough contact with the workaday world. A journey to Oxford, to visit an old friend, proved a pivotal point in his life. The fame of Coleridge as a poet had gone abroad, and the literary fledglings at Oxford sought to do the visitor honour in the proper way. Among others whom he met on this visit were Robert Southey and Robert Lovell, both poets of considerable local fame. Lovell had been married but a few months before to a young woman by the name of Fricker. Southey was engaged to a sister of the bride, and there was still a third sister fancy-free. The three poets became fast friends. They were all radicals, full of ambition to make a name for themselves, and all intent on elevating society out of the ruts into which it had fallen. All had suffered contumely on account of advanced ideas, and all were out of conceit with the existing order. They discussed the matter at length, and decided to set the world an example by founding an ideal colony and showing how to make the most of life. Coleridge had long been interested in America, and from an acquaintanceship with sundry soldiers who had helped fight the battles of George III in the New World, he had gathered a rather romantic idea of the country. The stories of returned sailors and soldiers, told to civilians, are seldom exactly authentic, and Coleridge the poet, bubbling with the effervescence of youth, argued that a home on the banks of the Susquehanna, with love and books and comradeship, was the ideal condition. The matter was broached to the three sisters Fricker, and they of course responded. What woman worthy of the name of woman would not? And so the arrangements were fast being made, and as a necessary feature, the three poets were duly and legally married to the three sisters, and Eden was to be peopled with the best. A date was arranged for sailing, but some trifling matter of finance delayed the exodus. In fact, certain expected loans were not forthcoming. Coleridge put in the time lecturing and preaching from Unitarian pulpits. He also tried his hand as editor, but the publication scheme failed to bring the shekels that were to buy emancipation. The innate contrariness of things seemed to be blocking all his plans. Meanwhile, we find Lovell drifting off into commercialism. That is to say, Barabbas-like, he had turned publisher. Gadzooks! What would you have a man with a wife and baby do? Live on moonshine? Well, well, well. Death claimed poor Lovell before he could make a success either of commerce or of art. End of section 16.